Have you ever wondered what it takes for complete strangers to become something more? Something like family? Well, hello there, my dear friends. I'm Joe. Some call me Gramps Joe. And at 65, I've earned that title with a few scars, a lot of stories, and more heart than I knew I had when I started this journey. Today, I want to invite you to join me by the glow of memory and the warmth of recollection. Unbundle in, perhaps with a cup of something hot. Maybe a cat curled up near your feet or the hum of a quiet house around you. You're in a good place, and I'm glad you're here. Now, I've seen my share of storms, both the kind that tear through the sky and the kind that rip through a life. But there was one storm that changed everything, not just for me, but for the whole block, for the folks next door and the people across the street whose names I barely knew until the power lines came down and left us all in the dark. That storm was Hurricane Sandy. You remember it, don't you? October 2012, they said it was gonna be bad. And it was. Winds howled like wolves. Rain came sideways. Streets turned to rivers. And all the comforts we once took for granted vanished in the blink of an eye. Lights out. Heat on food spoiling by the hour. Phone's dead. And yet, oddly enough, it turned into one of the warmest weeks of my life. How darkness can bring people into the light? Back then, I lived on a modest cul-de-sac in a little town on the Jersey Shore. Me and my wife Margaret had been there nearly 30 years. Same front porch, wash maple tree out front, same squeaky screen door that needed oiling every spring and fall. By then, our two kids had long since flown the coop, off raising families of their own in cities with taller buildings and faster lives. It was just the two of us, two old birds in a too quiet nest. Now, I'm not gonna lie, before Sandy, I didn't know half my neighbors by name. We'd nod politely when taking out the trash, maybe exchange a few words about the weather, but that was about it. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn, everyone caught up in their own little whirlwind of life, until the real whirlwind came. The night Sandy hit, the wind rattled the windows so hard I thought the house might split in two. Margaret clutched my hand tighter than she had in years, and I could feel her fear without her saying a word. At 2:17 a.m., the lights flickered once. And then Boyd once followed, except for the wind, which had its own kind of voice that night. Angry, unrelenting, ancient. We spent the rest of the night huddled together under blankets, listening to the storm batter our world. You never forget the sound of shingles being ripped off your roof or trees groaning before they fall. When morning finally arrived, it brought no comfort. The damage was clear. The big oak on the corner had fallen into the street, blocking both lanes. Power lines dangled like loose threads from the sky. The corner store, flooded. The gas station, empty. Phones, dead. We were cut off physically, emotionally, and electronically. And that's when something remarkable happened. It started small, a knock on the door. I opened it to find Martin from 2 doors down, a wiry man with silver hair and deep laugh lines, holding a thermos and a smile. "Hot coffee," he said, handing it to me. "Figured you could use some." Turns out he had a gas stove and a percolator. His wife Baylis had insisted they make extra. That thermos, it was like liquid gold. But more than that, it was the start of something bigger. Later that day, I found myself outside, clearing debris from the front yard, when I saw others doing the same, like survivors washing up on the same shore. We gathered, me, Martin, Alice, Nora from across the street, the teenage twins from the Ramirez family, and old Mr. Bishop who lived alone in the blue house at the end. Someone suggested we check on the elderly couple 3 doors down, the Haskins, who were both in their 80s. When we knocked, they were sitting in the dark, cold and scared, unsure of how long their oxygen tanks would last. That was our first mission. We pooled batteries, gathered blankets, even rigged up a makeshift charging station using car batteries for their medical devices. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And that's how it began, a chain reaction of compassion, one good deed sparking the next. By the second night, with no lights and nothing to do, folks started drifting into Martin and Alice's garage. They had dragged out old candles and a few lanterns, set up some folding chairs, and brewed more of that miraculous coffee. And we told stories, shared canned goods, and laughed. God, how we laughed. As if the laughter itself could push back the storm's leftover weight. That was the first time I learned Nora had been a jazz singer in her youth. Or that the Ramirez twins dreamed of becoming engineers. Or that Mr. DH's silent, lonely Mr. Bishop had once been a ballroom dancer and still remembered every step. I looked around that garage, the flickering lights dancing across tired faces, and I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't alone. None of us were. And somehow, in that flickering light, I realized how much I'd missed, how many years had passed without really knowing the people just a stone's throw away. Isn't it? How it takes the loss of power to restore a different kind of light? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stick with me, won't you? Because what happened in the days that followed, what we built from candlelight and shared soup, from borrowed batteries and borrowed time, it taught me more about community, resilience, and the kindness of neighbors than a lifetime of potlucks and block parties ever could. And in a world that sometimes feels like it's coming apart at the seams, I think those lessons might just matter now more than ever. Boom. If these words find you at a time when you need a little warmth, a little hope, or maybe just a reminder that people still care, I invite you to stay a while. And hey, if stories like this touch something in you, if they feel like a visit from an old friend, you might consider joining me here more often. We're building something special together. Story by story, memory by memory. Let me take you back to day 3, when the food started to run low and the real test of community began. Day 3 arrived with the kind of silence that's almost too loud. You know the kind I mean. No hum of the fridge, no news on the TV, no traffic passing by, just wind, rustling fallen branches, and the occasional bark of a restless dog. But the cold had crept in during the night. Not the bone-shattering chill of winter yet, but enough to make you feel stiff when you got out from under the covers. Enough to remind you just how much we take central heat for granted. Bird and I bundled up in layers. She wore her old green knit sweater, the one with the elbow patches she refused to throw away, and I had on my flannel that still smelled faintly of smoke from the night before. We boiled water on our camping stove for oatmeal and used the last bit of powdered milk we'd stored away during the Y2K scare. Funny how something you once thought was overkill can become gold in a crisis. Outside this, the street looked like something out of a Watermoon movie. Tree limbs littered lawns. The Haskins gutter had collapsed in the night. Nora's picket fence, once white and proud, leaned like an old man after too much whiskey. But there was movement, or two. Life. People were out and about, checking in, pitching in, saying. I waved to Martin, who was hauling a wheelbarrow of canned goods toward the Ramirez place. "Soup drives," he shouted, smiling. Trading some split pea for chili. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was adaptation. This was community beginning to rise from the wreckage. Around noon, we gathered again. This time in our driveway, I dragged out our old camping table, and folks brought what they had. Toast, crackers, apples that were starting to go soft. No one brought much, but all of it together made something close to a meal. Margaret ladled out some soup she'd made with bouillon cubes and whatever she could salvage from the thawing freezer. And it wasn't gourmet, but it was hot. And it was shared. And someone brought an old transistor radio with fresh batteries. And we sat huddled around it like kids from another era. listening to updates from the outside world. The governor was urging people to stay put. Oil companies said it might be another week. Relief crews were coming. Eventually. Then came the moment that changed everything for me. We were sitting in a circle, trading updates and stories, when Mr. Bishop, who'd barely said 10 words since the storm, cleared his throat. I was 12 during the great Northeast blackout of '65, he said, voice raspy but steady. My father lit a candle and said, "Son, sometimes you don't need electricity to see what matters." He looked around at us, eyes moist behind thick glasses. I think he was right. You could have heard a pin drop. That old man, who we all thought preferred to be left alone, had just said what none of us had quite found the words for yet. This wasn't just about enduring a natural disaster. This was about rediscovering something we'd misplaced, each other. I think about that moment a lot, the way one quiet voice can anchor a group, the way truth can land with the weight of a stone dropped in a still pond. And in that silence, the ripple reached all of us. That afternoon, we organized ourselves. Nora suggested a neighborhood map to check off who'd been checked on and who might need help. He volunteered his garage as supply central, and the twins ran house to house, taking stock of food, meds, and batteries. And Margaret, God bless her, offered to host story time for the little ones. Owen said it would give the parents a break and the kids something to look forward to. It was strange, in a way, how quickly we went from strangers to something else entirely. Not quite family, but more than neighbors. That night, and we gathered again, this time around a fire pit someone had dragged from their backyard. We roasted marshmallows. Of all things. Someone had unearthed a bag from the back of a pantry, and suddenly there we were, grown adults, hands sticky and faces glowing, telling ghost stories like kids on a camping trip, and somewhere between the laughter and the crackle of firewood, I realized I wasn't thinking about the things we'd lost anymore. I wasn't missing my usual comforts. I was there, for the first time in a long while. You ever have that feeling? Like you're part of something bigger than yourself? Like you belong in a way you hadn't realized was missing? That was me, sitting on a plastic lawn chair, holding Margaret's hand, and feeling for the first time in years, not alone, Ricky. And I'd bet, Biamasi, if you're still here with me now, that maybe you've known that feeling too. Or maybe, you're still looking for it. I don't have all the answers, my friend, but I do know this: when the lights go out and the world falls quiet, we get to see things more clearly. Things that mattered all along but got lost in the noise of everyday life. Stick with me. Because tomorrow, that's when the storm's aftermath threw us a curveball we never saw coming and forced us to ask a question I'll never forget. What do you do when the person you least expect to help becomes your hero? I remember waking up on day 4 to the sound of rain. Not the violent kind that slaps the windows sideways like Sandy had brought with her, but a softer, steady drizzle. It was the kind of rain that soaks the earth, not breaks it. The kind that forces you to slow down. Whether you want to or not, Margaret was already up. Sitting by the window with a flashlight and a mug of lukewarm tea, she had this quiet strength about her, like she was always a few steps ahead of fear. She turned to me and said, "We need to check on Miss Jolene." Now, here's the thing. Miss Jolene was what some folks might call difficult. Lived in the yellow house with the cracked mailbox. 2 doors down. She was in her late 70s, fiercely independent, and didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for anyone. She'd once yelled at the Ramirez twins for riding their bikes too close to her azaleas. And rumor had it she once called the town about someone's holiday lights being too loud, if you can believe that. And I'll admit it, I hadn't spoken more than 5 words to her in 10 years. But Margaret was right. The storm didn't care if someone was neighborly or not. And kindness doesn't come with a scorecard. So I pulled on my boots, grabbed an umbrella, and made my way down the block. Her porch steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once, then again. No answer. I was about to leave when I heard something, a soft, muffled sound, like someone calling from far away. Leaned in close to the door and heard it again. Help! My stomach dropped. I didn't think twice. I turned the handle. Unlocked. That surprised me. I stepped inside, calling her name. Miss Jolene? The living room was dark. I saw her then, lying on the kitchen floor, one hand stretched toward the table where a toppled chair lay. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Turns out she had slipped 2 days earlier, broken her hip. No phone, no family nearby, just a woman who had always kept to herself, now utterly alone and in pain. My voice trembled as I told her I was there, that she was safe. I wrapped her in blankets from her own linen closet and ran like I hadn't in years, back up the street yelling for help. The response was immediate. Martin showed up with a tarp to carry her. Nora brought pain meds from her emergency stash. The twins cleared the front path so we could get her out. We bundled her tight and got her to the Ramirez's minivan, which still had enough gas to make it to the nearest emergency clinic accepting storm cases. I rode with her in the back, holding her hand. She didn't say much, just squeezed my fingers when the pain got bad. Did after she was safely in the clinic's care. I sat in the parking lot and cried, not out of fear or sadness, but out of shame. Shame that it had taken a disaster for me to truly see another human being. You ever feel that? Like you passed by someone for years, judged them by a few sour words or a look, and then one moment cracks you open like an egg and makes you realize you had it all wrong? Miss Jolene, grumpy, Private Miss Jolene, had been lying on that cold floor for 2 days, hoping someone would knock. And it could have ended very differently if Margaret hadn't reminded me that being a good neighbor isn't about liking people. It's about showing up. Oh, that night, back at the fire pit, I told the others what had happened. I expected judgment or I told you tons, but instead, there was silence. Then Alice, Martin's wife, Wayne said, tomorrow we check every house, we job every single one. And we did, row by row, house by house, even the ones that looked empty. We left notes on doors, knocked on windows, peered through mail slots. We made sure no one got left behind again. It changed something in us, sure. We weren't just trying to get through the storm anymore. We were trying to carry each other through it. And I'll tell you what really surprised me. Miss Jolene came home 4 days later. The clinic had stabilized her, and a volunteer medical team brought her back with a walker, some bandages, and more attitude than ever. But this time, it was different. Because when she stepped out of that van, every single person on the block clapped. I mean it. Which we stood there in the putties, applauding an old woman who had once called animal control on someone's cat. And do you know what she did? She laughed. A real, with a full-bodied laugh, the kind that takes you by surprise. Then she looked around at all of us and said, I suppose I owe you all some banana bread. And the whole block cheered. That was the thing about Sandy. She didn't just take down trees and power lines, she broke down the fences we built around our hearts. So here's a little question I've been carrying with me since then. One I hope you'll consider too. What would it take for you to knock on someone's door? Not because they're your friend, but because they're human? I don't know what storms you've faced in your life, but I do know this. Some of the greatest connections come in the most unexpected moments. And often, they start with a simple decision. To care. Stick with me, will you? Because the very next day, we found something washed up in the middle of the street, and it led to the most unexpected reunion I've ever witnessed. And it was the morning of day 5 when I saw it. I just stepped outside, still rubbing sleep from my eyes, when I spotted something strange in the middle of the street. At first, I thought it was a tarp or a shredded piece of siding, but as I walked closer, I realized it was a photograph, soaked, curled at the edges, but mostly intact. A black and white picture of a young soldier in uniform, standing in front of what looked like a 1950s Ford pickup. Something about it stopped me cold. So you see, I was a Navy man myself once, back in '75, fresh out of high school. Buzz cut and bad judgment. That photo in the street, it wasn't just someone's waterlogged memory. It was a breadcrumb, a steen, a whisper from the past. I picked it up carefully, holding the delicate edges like they might turn to dust in my fingers. Then I walked from door to door, showing it to anyone who answered. It wasn't until I got to the second to last house on the block, the green one with the weathered porch and ivy creeping up the siding, that someone gasped. "That's my father," said a woman in her 50s, hand flying to her mouth. "I haven't seen that picture since I was a teenager." Her name was Denise. Lived there her whole life, apparently, kept to herself. Took care of her mother until she passed, and had worked nights at the pharmacy for the last 20 years. We must have lived 4 houses apart for 3 decades. I knew her face, but not her story. And now here she was, holding a piece of her past that had floated through floodwaters and landed in my hands. Well, she invited me in. The living room was dimly lit by candles, the air heavy with lavender and the faint smell of damp carpet. And she laid the photo down on a towel like it was something sacred, something rescued. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought everything was gone." That's when I noticed her eyes puffy from crying, the kind of sadness that doesn't scream, but hums like background noise. We talked for a while. She told me the house had flooded 3 feet in the basement. She lost old records, books, photo albums, memories, but somehow this one picture survived, and I had found it. "I think," she said slowly, "he wanted me to remember something today. That I'm not alone, And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what you believe about fate or bond or whatever's out there, but there are moments too perfect to be coincidence. That photo had traveled blocks, carried by water and wind. It could have gone anywhere, but it found her, and in doing so, it helped her find something in herself again. A tether, a reminder. When I left her house, the sky had cleared for the first time in days. Well, blue yet, but less gray. A little warmer. The kind of light that makes everything look a bit softer. And that afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Denise came to the fire pit, and she brought instant cocoa and a thermos of boiled water and said she hoped it wasn't too late to join. Nora scooted over and patted the empty seat beside her. "Never too late, hun." And just like that, a woman who had lived in our midst quietly, almost invisibly, became part of the circle. You ever notice how it just takes one invitation, one moment of kindness, one gesture of welcome to pull someone in from the cold? Not just the weather kind, but the emotional kind. The kind of cold that creeps in when you go years without being seen. That night, we shared stories again. Denise told us about her father's war medals, about the time he brought home a puppy without telling her mother, and how he used to hum Frank Sinatra when he cooked breakfast. It was like someone had turned on a light inside her. And I'll be darned if that wasn't true for all of us. We were changing, thawing, softening, bit by bit. As the storm receded outside, it seemed to take something heavy with it, something invisible that had kept us isolated for too long. It's easy to forget how much we all need to feel part of something. We get so caught up in bills and obligations, in routines and distractions. We wave from the driveway, we nod at the mailbox. But rarely do we really look, really ask, really listen. Until the world stops spinning for a moment, and then we see Denise quietly grieving. We see Miss Jolene alone on the floor. We see the twin worried about their friends they can't text. And maybe, if we're lucky, we see ourselves reflected in those we once thought were strangers. I looked around the fire pit that night and saw not just neighbors, but stories, whole, beating hearts. People who, 5 days earlier, I'd barely known. And now I couldn't imagine my life without them. Funny, isn't it? How it sometimes takes a storm to build something unshakable. So here's a thought I'll leave with you tonight. As the embers of this chapter glow soft, if you found a piece of someone's past floating in your path, would you return it? Would you knock? Would you step into their story? Just for a while, because the smallest gestures, picking up a photo, offering a thermos, sharing a meal, sometimes become the moments people remember for the rest of their lives. And sometimes they're the moments that rewrite your own. Come back tomorrow, will you? That's when the power came back on. And we had to decide whether we'd go back to who we were before or stay who we'd become. It happened on day 7. After a full week in the dark, with meals by flashlight and coffee warmed over fire pits, the lights finally came back on. It started as a flicker, just enough to make the bulbs tremble in the sockets like they weren't quite sure if it was safe, and then a full surge. The fridge kicked back to life with a low hum. A chorus of cheers erupted down the street. Someone, I think it was Martin, shouted, "Praise be to the power company." We laughed. We clapped. We ran inside to flip switches we didn't even need. Margaret actually cried when the heater kicked in. I just stood in the living room, arms folded, listening to the house breathe again. But I'll be honest with you, the relief didn't feel quite the way I thought it would. You see, part of me was afraid that everything we'd built that week would vanish along with the shadows. That once the televisions were blaring and the microwaves were humming, we'd all retreat back into our private little worlds, back behind our fences and schedules and polite distance. That night, our street glowed again, porch lights on, windows lit, radios playing soft music, but the fire pit remained dark. I stood at our window for a long time, waiting to see if anyone would come out, and then, like clockwork, Martin emerged from his garage with a folding chair and that old percolator, balancing a tray of peanut butter crackers, and then Nora, then Daniel with a bag of marshmallows in hand. And then quietly, one by one, the others appeared too, as if we all had the same thought. Maybe we could keep something going. Maybe this wasn't over. I grabbed my own chair and walked over, heart lighter than it had been in years. We sat there with the porch lights glowing all around us, but kept the fire going anyway. It wasn't about the heat anymore. It was about the ritual, the rhythm we'd fallen into. It felt Sid. Someone said we should do this every week. And before anyone could object, Alice pulled out a notepad and wrote, "Friday Night Fires." And just like that, a tradition was born. You see, something had shifted in us. In the silence of those powerless nights, we had found something powerful, each other. Not in a superficial, let's wave at each other once in a while kind of way, but something deeper. A bond forged not in comfort, but in crisis, in cooperation. And that bond didn't go away when the lights came on. It held. In the weeks that followed, we set up a shared tool shed, an old storage unit Nora had sitting in her backyard. We painted it blue, stocked it with the essentials, rakes, brooms and flashlights, extension cords. We called it the Block Bar. Someone started a group text. Denise, who'd been quiet for decades, became the unofficial event coordinator, organizing potlucks, birthday shout-outs, even a stormy versary party every October 29th. And Jolene, she actually made good on her banana bread promise. Wisdom that I've ever had. She assisted on teaching Margaret the recipe, and the two of them became as thick as thieves. Turns out she'd been lonely for years but didn't know how to say it. You know, I used to believe that real community was a thing of the past, that had died off with front porches and Sunday dinners. But I was wrong. The community isn't gone, it's just sleeping. They waiting for us to wake it up. Sometimes it takes a storm, sometimes a fire pit and a shared bag of marshmallows. And sometimes all it takes is noticing, choosing not to look away. But here's the part that still gets me. A few days after the power came back, I got a card in my mailbox and a written, no return address. It read, "Dear neighbor, thank you for helping make this the best worst week of my life. Let's never forget how it felt to need each other. Chind, someone who's glad you knocked in." I still don't know who wrote it. Could have been any of them, or all of them. But that card sits on my bookshelf to this day. A reminder that the storm didn't just bring rain and wind, it brought us clarity. It stripped away the noise and left behind the melody. I used to think disasters only destroyed, but now I know better. They also reveal what matters. Who we are and what we're capable of when we stop pretending we're islands and remember we're neighbors. And so if you've made it this far with me, friend, thank you. You're part of this circle too. In a way, wishing makes you a neighbor of the heart. And if you've ever felt like the lights in your life went out, whether literally or figuratively, I hope you remember this story. Remember that sometimes the darkest days bring the brightest connections, that sometimes in losing everything you thought mattered, you discover what truly does. Time. I'll tell you about the letter Margaret found under our welcome mat a year later. It was unsigned, but it changed everything again. So don't go far. I've still got a lot more to share with you. It was almost a full year later. The trees had grown back their leaves, the broken fences had been repaired, and the block box was now stocked like a miniature Home Depot. Life, as it does, had moved on. But something about that week in the dark still lingered like perfume on an old coat, faint, but never really gone. Margaret and I were on our way out to the farmer's market that morning, and it was a Saturday in late October. The air crisp and full of wood smoke. I remember she was wearing her wool shawl, the red one with the acorns stitched along the edge, and I was fussing with the zipper on my windbreaker when she bent down to pick up the mail. There, tucked under the welcome mat, just like that anonymous card a year ago, was a small white envelope. No name, no stamp. Just the words "Read me" in tidy cursive across the front. She handed it to me, and I raised an eyebrow. Another secret admirer. She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. We opened it together, standing right there on our porch steps. Inside was a short note, written on yellowed stationery. Sometimes we lose things so we can find what matters. Thank you for what you gave me that week. Hope, warmth, and the courage to come home. No signature, no hint, just that. I stood there alone at that time, staring at the words AMC. "What do you think it means?" Margaret asked, gently. I didn't know. Yes, and not for sure, but deep down I had a hunch. You remember Denise, the woman with the photo of her father? Well, it turns out she had a brother, estranged. Hadn't spoken in nearly 20 years after a falling out over the family estate. From what I gathered, she never spoke of him in detail, only mentioned that he'd disappeared into his own anger. But one evening, months after the storm, I saw a man I didn't recognize sitting beside her at the fire pit. Same nose, same smile. He was quiet, just listening. I'm watching her as she passed out mugs of cider and told a story about how her father once built a treehouse with nothing but rope and a hammer. She never introduced him. He left early, but I remembered his eyes, haunted, but softening. And now, this letter. I think maybe the storm did more than bring neighbors together. Or maybe it mended things that went deeper than the power grid, and maybe it was the excuse some of us needed to forgive. Forgiveness. Now there's a word we don't toss around enough. You ever carry a grudge so long it starts to feel like furniture in your life? Part of the landscape. You forget what the room looked like before it was there, but then something happens. Some jolt, some shift, and suddenly you see the space differently. You realize what you've been missing. I think that's what happened for Denise's brother. He came back, quietly, just long enough to sit beside the sister he'd once loved, to see the life she'd built, the community she'd become part of. Maybe he realized she hadn't been waiting for him, but she'd made room for him anyway. Margaret tucked the note into her coat pocket, and we walked onto the market like we always did. Bought honey from the local beekeeper, picked up a couple of cider donuts, and held hands without needing to talk too much. But that note, it stayed with me, and it got me thinking about how many of us walk around carrying stories we've never told, hurts we've never healed, and apologies we've never said, and how maybe, just maybe, the most unexpected storm can become a permission slip to start over, to say I'm sorry, to come home. That Sunday at the fire pit, I told the story of the envelope, didn't name names, just shared the message, let it hang in the air like incense. People nodded, some looking down into their mugs. A few held each other's hands a little tighter. And after a long and quiet moment, Jolene, yes, Jolene spoke up. I spent 10 years angry at my sister, she said. We haven't spoken since the day she moved to Florida. I blamed her for leaving, for not helping with Mama's care, for always acting like she was too good for this town. She paused, and stirring her tea. But that week, I thought I was going to die alone on my kitchen floor. And y'all didn't let that happen. I don't think I ever said thank you properly. Her voice cracked a little then, and none of us knew quite what to say. So we did what we'd learned to do in moments like that. We made space, and eventually, she continued. I called her, she said, last week, told her I missed her, told her I was sorry. And then, smiling through tears, she said, she's coming to visit next month, bringing her grandbabies. There was a long silence. Then Martin raised his cup to second chances. We all drank to that. You see, the storm taught us how to survive. But what came after? That taught us how to live again. It reminded us that healing doesn't always come from doctors or medicine, and sometimes it comes from being seen, being invited, being forgiven. And it comes from realizing that it's never too late to knock on someone's door, especially if that door once felt closed for good. And so if you're carrying something heavy, my friend, some regret, some name you haven't spoken in years, maybe this is your letter under the mat. Maybe this story is your nudge. You can always come home. And sometimes the best place to start is right next door. It's time. I want to tell you about the evening we held a candlelight vigil, not for anyone we'd lost, but for everything we'd found. You won't want to miss that. I'll see you there. Same time, same circle. It was a week before Thanksgiving when Nora suggested we hold a vigil. Nora wasn't usually one for ceremony. She was more the type to fix your window screen with duct tape and a butter knife, then hand you a Tupperware full of something hot and spicy with zero explanation. But when she spoke that night at the fire pit, we all leaned in. Maybe we should do something, she said, poking at the embers, to mark it. That week, not a party, something quieter, something sacred. It got real still around the circle. I mean, she continued, we lighted candles for what we've lost, why not for what we found? And just like that, a new tradition was born. We didn't want it to be a spectacle. No flyers, no fuss, just neighbors, candles, and silence. We chose the park down the street, the one with the broken swing and the war memorial, and met there at sunset on a chilly November Friday. Margaret and I arrived early. She carried a box of tea lights in old mason jars, and I brought a thermos of mulled cider. Denise brought her father's photo, tucked inside a locket, and the Ramirez twins arrived with their younger cousins, each holding a homemade lantern made from milk jugs and string lights. Which one type on? People drifted in, while came alone, others with children. No one spoke much. We just nodded, hugged, placed our candles along the footpath and watched as the soft glow grew. And then Nora stepped forward, holding a single candle in both hands. She didn't give a speech. She just said this This is for the week we found out what neighbors really are. That was all. But somehow, it was everything. Almost one by one, we followed her lead. Some said a few words. Others placed their candles in silence. This is for the knock on the door that came just in time. This is for my mother's rocking chair, the only thing we saved. This is for my children, who saw grown-ups come together for once. This is for the soup we shared, the laughter in the dark. And one voice, soft but clear, said, "This is for the life I almost gave up on, until someone sat with me." I don't know who said that, they were gone before I could find them in the crowd. But I've never forgotten it, because that's what that week did. It sat with people. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase what had been broken, but it showed up. It said, "You're not alone," and sometimes that's enough to save a life. After the last candle was placed, we stood there a while longer, watching the little lights flicker in the breeze like stars that had fallen just far enough to be close. No speeches, no music, just the sound of breath, of people standing together in quiet memory. And as I looked around at the people I now knew, their stories, their laughs, their stubborn hearts, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Belonging, the kind that doesn't come from shared blood or years of friendship, but from shared experience, shared kindness. You know, we live in a world now that moves fast. Too fast, sometimes, and it's easy to feel invisible in it, to be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. But that week, that vigil, it reminded us that presence matters, that seeing someone, truly seeing them, that is a gift. That just standing beside someone can be a form of love. As we started to pack up that night, I noticed Miss Jolene sitting quietly on a bench, candle in hand, eyes misty but soft. I sat beside her, didn't say a word, but after a moment, she spoke. "You know what I regret most?" she asked. I shook my head gently. In all those years I spent guarding my loneliness, it's like it was something precious. Her voice cracked on the last word. I reached out and squeezed her hand. She didn't let go. And in that moment, I realized something else. Loneliness doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it wears a mask of independence and of pride. Of "I'm fine, thank you very much." But the truth is, we all need each other. Not just during storms, but every ordinary day in between. The next morning, we found little candles placed on each doorstep. No note, just a silent reminder. And the Friday fires never stopped. Rain or shine, winter or summer, we showed up, not because we had to, but because we wanted to, because we had finally remembered something our grandparents knew instinctively. That community isn't a luxury, it's a need. And that lighting a candle for what you've found is just as important as lighting one for what you've lost. So if you're feeling a little lost yourself these days, a little dimmed by time or grief or just the rush of it all, maybe light a candle tonight, even just a tiny one, for the good you've witnessed, for the kindness you've given, for the people who showed up when it mattered most. And if no one has told you lately, you matter. You're part of the light, and you're always welcome at the fire. I'll tell you the story of how one small garden plot behind Martin's garage became the heart of our neighborhood, and how we learned to grow more than just vegetables in that soil. Hope you'll come back for that. There's something special about growing things. Maybe it's the miracle of it, the way a seed, no bigger than a freckle, can become something green and proud if given time, care, and a little sunlight. Or maybe it's the quiet hope that gardening carries, that even after the hardest winter, something soft and living will rise again. Either way, it was Margaret who first suggested we try planting a shared garden. We were sitting around the fire pit one spring evening, early April, I think. The daffodils had started poking their heads up along the sidewalk cracks, and the trees were still bare but humming with promise. Martin had been talking about how his wife Alice missed her herb boxes, which had been destroyed during the storm, Denise mentioned how the corner grocery still hadn't reopened, and prices at the chain store were eating into her budget. That's when Margaret, ever gentle but never shy, thought, well, maybe it's time we grew something together. Just like that. Oh, at first it sounded like wishful thinking, but the kind of suggestion people nod at politely but never follow up on. But the next morning, Martin called me, said he had an old rototiller in the shed and a patch of land behind his garage that got good sun. You bring the seeds, he said. I'll bring the sweat. I laughed, but I said yes. And so it began. We started small, just a rectangle of soil about 15 feet wide, bordered by stacked bricks salvaged from Nora's old chimney. The Ramirez twins cleared rocks and debris, and little Mikey from down the street painted a crooked sign that said, "Neighbor's garden, please be kind." The whole thing felt like a patchwork quilt made of hope and dirt. We planted tomatoes, green beans, peppers, lettuce, and a row of marigolds to keep the bugs away. Margaret's idea. Jolene brought mint clippings from her windowsill pots. Even Mr. Bishop showed up with a bag of garlic bulbs and a pair of gloves that looked older than some of our cars. And every Saturday morning, we met there, sometimes 10 of us, sometimes just 2 or 3. We watered, weeded, harvested, but mostly we talked. And that little garden became a sanctuary. So a place to be quiet together, to check in, to laugh, to grumble about the rabbits, to celebrate every tiny sprout like it was a miracle, which, in a way, it was. One morning in June, I found Nora kneeling between the pepper plants, her hands deep in the soil, tears streaming down her cheeks. I knelt beside her, unsure whether to speak. "It's stupid," she said, without looking up. "Just this dirt? My husband loved gardening. Died 2 years ago. I haven't touched a trowel since. But today," her voice cracked, "today I smelled the basil, and it felt like he was here again." And I put a hand on her shoulder. "That's not stupid," I said. "That's sacred." And we sat there in the quiet warmth, 2 people in their 60s, in knees dirty and hearts wide open. Because grief, like seeds, grows quietly. It waits in the soil of our lives, and sometimes all it needs is a little light to bloom again, not as pain, but as remembrance. By July, the garden was overflowing. We started hanging baskets on fences, leaving zucchinis on doorsteps with notes that read, "Yes, this is for you, no take-backs." The kids painted rocks to use as plant markers. Emma's carrots had googly eyes. And one strawberry sign simply read, "Yum." But more than food, we were growing something else. Roots. Not the kind that stretch into the soil, but the kind that anchor people. The kind that wrap around shared memories, laughter, and the quiet comfort of familiarity. One night in August, we held a garden dinner right there beside the tomato vines. Everyone brought a dish made with something from the plot. Elaine made mint lemonade, Joelle made stuffed peppers, and Margaret, bless her, made her famous zucchini bread, which disappears faster than secrets at a family reunion, and we strung fairy lights from Martin's fence. The kids played tag until the fireflies outnumbered them, and just as dessert was being served, little Mikey stood on a milk crate and said, "This garden makes me feel like everyone's my cousin." We all laughed. But then we clapped. Because somehow then that child had said what none of us had figured out how to yet. That this space, this patch of soil and sweat and second chance, had made us kin, not by blood, by care, by choice. I used to think family was limited to who you shared a last name with, but now I know better. Family is who shows up with a shovel when you need to dig, who sits beside you in silence when the basil reminds you of someone you lost, who saves the last tomato just because they know it's your favorite. That summer garden changed us, not because we grew great vegetables, though we did, but because we grew something even rarer, a community that knew how to nurture more than plants. A circle of people who learned that healing could come through shared soil, dirty fingernails, and sunburned shoulders. And maybe, just maybe, through one boy's crooked sign and one widow's mint clipping, we found a way to keep that storm's memory alive, not as destruction, but as the beginning of something that couldn't have happened any other way. So next time you see a vacant lot, or an empty flower bed, or even a window box in need of care, consider planting something. Tutting, even if it's just a single seed, because you never know what else might grow alongside it. Today, I want to tell you about the day the kids ran a lemonade stand, not to make money, but to raise enough for new boots for Mr. Bishop, and what he said when he found out. It still makes me tear up, so I hope you'll come back. It was the kind of day that makes you forget everything bad that ever happened, or late September. The air warm but gentle, with that subtle golden hue you only get as summer tips into fall. The kind of day where the sunlight doesn't just shine, it wraps around you like a hug from someone you haven't seen in a long time. I was watering the far side of the garden, our little miracle patch behind Martin's garage, when I saw the Ramirez twins and their friends setting up a table near the sidewalk. They were hauling out a cooler, stacking cups, unwrapping signs written in marker on cardboard. "Lemonade stand," said Emma, the older of the two, flashing a proud smile. "But we're not keeping the money." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, who's the lucky beneficiary?" She looked over her shoulder and whispered, like she was sharing a state secret. "Mr. Bishop. We heard his boots are falling apart. He keeps tying the soles with string." I blinked. "You're raising money for boots?" "Yup. We found some online, Mr. Senna, 54 miles in the waterproof. Warm lining. We're gonna get him the good kind. Hey. The kind that don't hurt your feet." She beamed. Whereupon, unfiltered compassion. I swallowed a lump in my throat. "That's a real kind of you." The kids spent the next 4 hours waving signs at passing cars, pouring lemonade, and even offering backyard tours of the garden for a donation. Little Mikey had the pitch down to an art. "Come see the biggest tomato on the East Coast. Only $2. Neighbors came out in droves. Some for the lemonade, some for the end of watching something good unfold in real time. Barton dropped a $10 bill into the jar, saying, "Tell Bishop they're from Santa Claus." Jolene handed over a 20 and said, "Make sure they're waterproof, though. He hates wet socks." Even Denise, who'd been quiet lately, brought a mason jar full of change she said she'd been saving since high school. This feels like the right reason to let it go. By the end of the day, they'd raised $83.12, enough for the boots and a new pair of wool socks. Now, the hard part, giving them to Mr. Bishop without making him feel like a charity case. That's where Margaret came in. She had a gift. That woman, the way she handled things, graceful, respectful, tender. She wrapped the boots in brown paper and tied them with twine and left them on his doorstep with a note that read, "For the walks ahead, from the ones who walk beside you." The next evening, we saw him at the fire pit, wearing the boots. Didn't say anything about them at first. Just settled into his usual chair, nodded at the circle, and pulled his coat tighter against the breeze. But then, as the stars came out and the fire crackled low, he cleared his throat. "I was 14 when I got my first pair of good boots," he said. "Wore them until the soles gave out. My father said, a man only needs 2 things to go far, good boots and someone who believes in him." He paused, looked around the circle. "I guess I've got both now, And then, without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a harmonica, and began to play. Soft at first, a tune none of us recognized, but all of us felt. It was like the music wrapped around the evening, held it close, and when he finished, the silence afterward wasn't empty. It was full of emotion, of reverence and of love. You see, that's the thing about small acts where they aren't small at all. A lemonade stand, a wrap beacon on a porch, a child's crooked phone, and a mason jar of pennies. They add up. They always do so. What's just in dollars, but in dignity, in connection time, but in trust. That day, those kids didn't just buy boots. They gave a proud and egalitarian man the kind of warmth no fire can match, the feeling of being valued, when he, in turn, gave us something too, his music, his story, his presence. And that night, and after the fire had gone cold and the chairs were stacked, I lingered a bit longer in the garden and looked up at the stars. Thought about my own childhood, about the boots my old man saved up for, how I scuffed them to pieces playing army with my cousins. Thought about how much it means when someone sees what you need and fills it without fanfare. I think we forget, in the busyness of life, how powerful it is to show up. But I've learned, especially in these later years, that showing up is half the magic. So if there's someone in your life right now, a neighbor, a relative, a grumpy old man down the street, maybe there's a way you can show up for them. Doesn't have to be much. A kind word, a warm meal, a pair of dry bikes. Because we never really know how long someone's been walking with holes in their shoes. And sometimes, giving them boots is the same as giving them hope. I want to share with you what happened when Margaret fell ill, and how the very neighbors we once barely knew became the hands that held us through one of our hardest seasons. That story is tender, but it's real one. And I'd be honored if you came back for it. Didn't see it coming. Margaret had always been the healthy one between us. Never smoked, walked every morning, on her greens, even when I tried to sneak mine to the moth under the table. Her laugh had this musical lilt that made the darkest mornings feel like sunshine. And that woman could organize a pantry better than the National Guard could coordinate a relief effort. So when she started getting tired more often, I brushed it off. We're just getting older, I said, chuckling. Yeah, it's that time of year. The soy sets before dinner. Everyone's a little sluggish. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One morning, she didn't come down for breakfast. I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor like she was somewhere else entirely. My chest feels tight, she whispered. Oh no, not painful, just wrong. We were in the emergency room an hour later. The diagnosis was quick and a type of arrhythmia. Not immediately life-threatening, but serious. Required medication, monitoring, in a slower pace of life, something Margaret wasn't used to. And she'd always moved through life like it was a garden that needed constant tending. Well, she was the one being tended to. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly the roles reverse. By 1 minute, you're the one leaning on someone, and the next, you're the one they're leaning on. And no matter how long you've been married, 35 years, in our case, nothing prepares you for that shift. I tried to be strong. I made her tea, took over the laundry, cooked, bitly, but with heart. She smiled through it all, even when my chicken stew tasted like cardboard. But I was scared. And as strong as I tried to be, I knew I couldn't carry it all alone. I remember standing in our kitchen one evening, staring at the prescription bottles lined up on the counter, when there was a knock at the door. It was Alice. No words. Just a smile, a Tupperware full of soup, and a note that read, "Don't you dare give her your cooking. Let us take care of this for a while." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. On the next day, there were more knocks. Jolene brought fresh bread and insisted on washing our dishes while she chatted a bit. Denise dropped off puzzles and a thermos of hot cocoa. The Ramirez kids mowed our lawn without being asked. And Martin? He showed up every afternoon around 3 p.m. just to sit with me on the porch and say nothing at all. That silence, it said everything, and it said, "You're not in this alone." The Friday fire that week was held in our backyard. The others said it was time we sat still and let them come to us. They brought the chairs, the lights, It even strung up little paper lanterns from the eaves. It was like the whole neighborhood leaned in around us and said, "We've got you." Margaret sat bundled in blankets, color back in her cheeks, see her smile soft but steady. She looked at me, then at them, and said, "I used to think I needed to be strong for everyone, but now I see how beautiful it is to let others be strong for me." You know what that is? Grace. It's the grace of allowing love in, of knowing that sometimes accepting or help is the most generous thing you can do because it gives others the gift of purpose. That winter was one of the coldest in years. But inside our home, there was warmth I can't explain. Meals arrived regularly, and neighbors took turns grocery shopping for us. Denise started a check-in calendar so that someone would stop by every single day, just to chat, sit, or help with errands. It was community in its purest form, not flashy, not performative, just steady, consistent care. And you know what? Margaret got better. Not just because of the meds or the follow-ups or the rest, but because of the love. I truly believe that. There's a kind of healing that science can't measure. It comes from kindness, from presence, from knowing that your well-being matters to more than just one other person, that you are held. I've thought a lot since then about all the people who go through illness or grief or hardship behind closed doors, alone, stoic, invisible, and how many would feel different, stronger, braver, less afraid if someone just knocked on their door and said, "We're here." So if you're someone who's always been the helper, like Margaret, maybe it's your turn to receive. And if you're someone who isn't sure what to say or do when a neighbor is struggling, just knock. Soup. But you don't need the right words. You just need to be there. Because sometimes the simple act of presence can pull someone back from the edge of despair. Margaret would later say that those weeks were the most beautiful of her life, not because of the struggle, but because of the love that rose up around her like a tide. He said, "I used to believe community was something you built. But now I see it's something you become, and I couldn't agree more." I want to share the bittersweet day when Margaret and I decided to leave that old house behind. A hard choice, but one that led us to something unexpected and deeply meaningful. Hope you'll be there for that one. It's close to my heart. The decision to leave wasn't sudden. It had been stirring in the quiet corners of our lives for a while. Like dust you only notice when sunlight hits it just right. Margaret had regained her strength. But she was moving slower now, and the stairs were becoming less of a challenge and more of a hazard. That old house we loved so it creaked more than it used to. The winters felt longer. The garden needed more hands than we could give. One morning, we were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee as the sun poured in through the lace curtains. Margaret was holding her favorite mug, the chipped one with the bluebirds, and staring out toward the maple tree out front, the one we'd planted together our first year there. Its branches were bare now, etched against the pale sky like lines in a well-worn face. She looked at me and said softly, "Maybe it's time." I didn't have to ask what she meant. I just reached across the table and took her hand. Truth is, I'd been thinking the same. We weren't running away, we were making room. Room for ease, room for breath, for smaller spaces and bigger moments, for less upkeep and more presence. But my heart ached at the thought. That house held a lifetime by the grooves in the wood floors where the kids had raced toy cars, the sun-faded spot on the wall where our first photo hung, the porch where we'd watched the world change around us, and then where we'd watched ourselves change with it. And then, of course, there were the neighbors, our circle, our fire pit family. When we broke the news, I expected tears. I expected someone to protest, but instead, there was this quiet, generous acceptance. Martin nodded and said, "Sometimes the best gardens need to be replanted in new soil." Alice hugged Margaret for a long time and whispered, "Just tell us where to bring the soup." Denise offered to help pack. The twins offered to carry boxes. Jolene baked her famous cinnamon bread and told us she'd come haunt us if we didn't visit monthly. That last month in the house was a blur of cardboard and memories. Every drawer held echoes. Every cabinet door creaked with nostalgia. We sorted through decades of life, deciding what to bring, what to give, what to let go. And through it all, the neighbors came, helping, reminiscing, sitting with us when it got too heavy to do anything else. And on our last night, they held a farewell fire in our backyard. It was cold, but no one seemed to mind it. There were blankets passed around, mugs of cider, laughter under the string lights one of the Ramirez kids had put up in secret. Martin brought his old guitar, played the same 3 songs he'd known since 1979, but they sounded like home. And then, something remarkable happened. Bishop stood up. Bishop wasn't a man of many words. But that night, he cleared his throat and said, "You know, when I moved here, I figured I'd die without anyone knowing my name. I was okay with that. Figured I'd earned my loneliness." He looked at us, at me and Margaret. "But then you two, you went and messed that up." We laughed, mouthed tenderly, because we understood what he meant. "I'm going to miss you more than I can say," he continued. "But I won't ever forget what you did here, what you started." And then he stepped forward and handed us something. It was a rock, painted red. Knit, in shaky but careful letters, were the words, "This is not goodbye, this is planting season." I kept that rock in my coat pocket all the way to the new place. We moved into a smaller home 2 towns over, a 1 floor, wide hallways. A little garden bed in the back, just big enough for a few tomatoes and a stubborn rosemary bush. But the real gift came the following week, because on Friday evening, as the sun began to set, there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find the Ramirez twins, grinning ear to ear, holding a portable fire pit and a bag of marshmallows. "We figured the fire comes with you, 50s, Emma said. Behind them were Martin and Alice, lugging lawn chairs. Denise with a crock pot. Jolene, of course, with that bread. They'd driven 45 minutes just to keep the ritual alive. We set up in the backyard, lit the flames, and passed around cups of cocoa like we'd never left. And suddenly I understood something I hadn't before. Our home isn't a place, but it's a gathering, or a glow, son. A group of people willing to carry the fire to wherever you are." That night, Margaret leaned against me and whispered, "We didn't leave anything behind. We brought it with us." And she was right. Because love, real love, travels. Community does, too. You don't lose it when you move. You water it, like a root cutting, and watch it take hold in new soil. If you've ever had to leave a place you loved, I hope you remember this. What mattered most doesn't stay behind. It walks beside you, in painted rocks, in fire pits, in friends who show up anyway. I'll tell you about the unexpected visitor who knocked on our door that first winter in our new home, someone I hadn't seen in decades, and who brought with him a story that changed everything. I can't wait to share it with you. It was just after New Year's. The sky was the color of unwashed wool, and a thin frost painted the windows. Margaret had gone out with Alice and Denise for what they called a necessary girls' outing, involving tea, thrift stores, and loud laughter I was grateful not to interrupt. Then I was alone, halfway through a crossword puzzle and halfway through a second cup of coffee, when there was a knock at the door. Not the usual kind, not the polite, practiced triple tap of a neighbor. No, this knock was heavy, intentional. Like whoever was on the other side had stood there for a long time before raising their hand. I opened the door and froze. Standing there was someone I hadn't seen in over 30 years. He looked older. Of course, Tim had carved its name in the corners of his eyes and the stoop of his shoulders. But I'd know that face anywhere. "Caleb," I said, voice dross. He nodded, gave a weak smile. Hey, Joe. Caleb was my brother, older by 3 years, and once my best friend in the whole wide world. We'd grown up thick as thieves, climbing trees, building forts, sharing secrets that only brothers share. But somewhere along the line, after our dad passed, after the estate, after a dozen things neither of us handled well, we stopped speaking. 30 years of silence. Until night, boss. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside, still stunned. He looked around the house, took in the framed photos, the cozy mess of a lived-in home, and said softly, "It feels like you." We sat down at the kitchen table, the same one Margaret and I had shared coffee over just hours before. I poured him a cup. He didn't touch it. "I've been watching," he said. Not in a creepy way, he added quickly, then smiled sheepishly. "Through the grapevine, heard about what you did during the storm. The neighbors, the fire pit, the garden." Got me thinking. I said nothing, just let the silence make space. He reached into his coat and pulled out a weathered envelope. "I wrote this a year after Dad died," he said. "Never mailed it. Didn't know where to send it. Didn't think it mattered. But I've carried it ever since." He slid it across the table to Fionn. I didn't open it right away. Just held it. He'd felt its weight. "I was angry," he said. "You saw myself. A life, but bloody. I was lost. And I didn't know how to come back." His voice cracked then, and he looked down. "But when I heard about what you dare me, how you showed up for people, how you built something out of a storm, it reminded me of the brother I used to know." I stared at him. I meant at this man I had once shared a bedroom with. Who knew my favorite cereal and how I chipped my front tooth and the way I used to cry during the thunderstorms. "I never stopped being your brother," I said finally. "I just didn't know how to reach you either." We sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that heals. Eventually, I opened the letter. It was short. Just a few lines, handwritten in his unmistakable scrawl. "Joe, I'm sorry for the anger. If there's any way back, I'd like to take it. Your brother, Caleb." I looked up. His eyes were glassy, searching. And I said the only thing that felt true. "You're already home." He stayed for dinner. Margaret came back and didn't miss a beat, just hugged him like he'd been gone 5 minutes instead of 30 years. The neighbors came over later, curious about the stranger. When we introduced him as my brother, someone shouted, "Well, it's about time." We sat around the portable fire pit that evening. Caleb didn't say much, but I could see him soaking it in, the warmth, the laughter, the easy rhythm of people who cared about each other. When we were alone, he asked, "Do you think it's too late to start again?" I put a hand on his shoulder. "Not even close. You see, storms come in many forms. All of them are hurricanes. Some are words left unsaid. Letters never mailed. Bridges burned not with fire, but with silence. But just as storms can tear things down, they can also clear the path and make room, which reveal what really matters." That visit from Caleb, it changed something in me. It reminded me that healing doesn't always come in the dramatic gesture. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of an envelope, a knock on the door, a voice that says, "I'm still here," and it reminded me that it's never too late. Never too late to forgive, to rebuild. Maybe there's someone in your life like that, someone you once loved deeply and lost to time or anger or stubborn pride. I won't tell you what to do. That's not my place. But I will say this, sometimes the first step home is just one knock away. Next time, I'll tell you about the moment we finally took our Friday fires public, how the whole town joined us for a night none of us will ever forget. I hope you'll join me. It started with a letter. Not a handwritten one this time, but a typed note on crisp paper. slipped into our mailbox and sealed with a logo from the city council. First, I thought it was one of those notices about street repairs or a change in recycling pickup. But when I opened it and read the first line, my eyebrows shot up. We've heard about your neighborhood fire gatherings and would like to invite you to host a community-wide version in the town square. I reread it 3 times, half expecting a punchline. Margaret looked over my shoulder, chuckled, and said, "Well, looks like the world's finally catching on." Turns out, word about our Friday fires had spread. Denise's niece worked at City Hall and had shared photos on social media, the kind that make people nostalgic for something they never had. Pictures of us laughing around the flame, little Mikey roasting marshmallows, Jolene handing out banana bread like communion. The city wanted in. They offered the town square, right in front of the old library, and said they'd provide seating, music, and even free hot cocoa. All we had to do was bring the heart. We weren't sure at first. Our fires were intimate, familiar, sacred in their simplicity. What would happen if we opened the circle too wide? But in the end, we all agreed it was worth a try. Maybe other people were longing for the same connection we'd found. Maybe we could offer that light to others. So we said yes. That Friday, we arrived early. The city had outdone itself. There were bales of hay set up in a ring, lanterns strung between trees, tables with mugs and blankets. A local band played soft acoustic music, and the smell of cider and cinnamon filled the cold November air. And then the people came. Not just our block, but people from every corner of town. Young couples with babies strapped to their chests, teenagers with earbuds dangling around their necks, retirees with thermoses and twinkling eyes. So, people we hadn't seen in years, and they came curious, and they left connected, and we started the fire. Just like always. Martin did the honors, striking the match like it was a sacred ritual. The flames rose, and with them, the conversations. People sat with strangers and shared stories. A woman talked about losing her husband the year before and how lonely dinner had become. A teenager admitted he didn't know any of his neighbors, but wanted to. A man in a veteran's cap told a story that left everyone wiping their eyes. No one checked their phones. No one looked at their watches. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing us back to something ancient and essential, being together. Then came the moment I'll never forget. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, walked up to the center of the circle, holding a drawing. She held it high for everyone to see. It was a crayon version of a fire pit with stick figures around it, and each figure had a heart drawn on their chest. "This is what it feels like," she said shyly. And just like that, silence fell. Grown men with tears in their eyes. Because that's the thing, we're all walking around hungry for that feeling, and the feeling of belonging, of being seen, of being part of something that doesn't demand perfection, just presence. That night, when the last mug was emptied and the fire burned low, the mayor came up to me. "I don't know what kind of magic you folks discovered during that storm," he said, "but I hope it spreads." And I smiled, because it already had. You see, you don't need a disaster to build community. You don't need to lose power to find your people. You just need to light a fire and make room for others to gather around it. We kept hosting those town square fires every season. Spring blooms, summer evenings, in crisp autumns, people kept coming. And each time the circle grew, we shared recipes, traded phone numbers, started carpools and book clubs and garden swaps. Soon, the town started feeling smaller, not because it shrank, but because the space between people got shorter. And every time someone asked how it all began, I'd tell them the same thing. It started with a storm, but it grew with choice. Because once we saw what was possible, once we'd tasted that depth of connection, we couldn't go back to nodding from driveways and waving from behind windshields. We chose each other. And I believe we still can. Maybe your town needs that fire. Maybe your street. Maybe your building. Maybe your own heart. It doesn't have to be big. doesn't have to be perfect. Just consistent, just warm, just real. Next time, I'll tell you about the bittersweet final fire we held before Margaret and I took one last journey together. One we knew was coming, but still weren't ready for. It's a hard story, but it's full of love. And I'd be honored to share it with you. I knew something was different by the way she looked at the garden. It was a quiet morning in late May. Margaret and I were sipping coffee on the porch of our new home, the rosemary bush just beginning to bloom. She had that faraway look in her eyes, the one I used to see when she watched old home videos of the kids, a mixture of love and longing, stillness and goodbye. "I think I'm ready," she said, voice barely louder than the breeze. I nodded. I knew what she meant. The truth is, we'd been living with the diagnosis for a while, cancer. The word had arrived like a thief in the night, quiet, unexpected, and cruel in its precision. It was advanced, treatable, they said, but not curable. And Margaret, with her eternal grace, chose a path of peace. "Oh, I don't want to fight the tide," she told me. "I want to dance in the shallows while the sun still shines." And so we did. We slowed down, walked more, laughed more, watched the birds at the feeder like they were old friends. She read poetry again, and I started writing down our stories. And every Friday of Forestry, the fire circle came to us, where they brought music, Jari's banana bread and mapayan. Jolene even sang once, slightly off key, but with so much heart it made Margaret cry and laugh at the same time. We never talked about the end. We talked about now, about how full our hearts were, and about how love, real love, doesn't fear the finish line. It embraces it like the closing chapter of a story well told. And then came the final fire. One day, it was early June, just before the solstice, the longest day of the year. Margaret had grown weaker, but insisted on sitting outside. "I want to see everyone," she said. One more time, with the stars overhead. The neighbors knew. They didn't say it out loud, but they knew. They came in droves, not with casseroles or sympathy cards, but with guitars, flowers, childhood drawings, and stories about Margaret, and about how she had changed their lives. Nora said she found the courage to forgive her sister because of a conversation they'd had. Denise told how Margaret had slipped a note into her mailbox once that simply read, "You are not invisible." Martin couldn't speak, just hugged her, kissed her hand, and sat beside her in silence. And the kids surrounded her like she was a campfire of her own, drawing warmth from her even now. Margaret listened to every word, smiled, nodded, whispered thank you over and over again. Then she looked at me and said softly, This is what a life means." I held her hand, kissed her temple, and whispered, "You lit the match. Love, we just kept the flame going." That night, under a sky littered with stars, we all sat long after the fire burned low. No one wanted to leave, because we knew this was more than a goodbye. It was a celebration, a witness, a love letter to a woman who had quietly woven a neighborhood into a family. Margaret passed away 3 weeks later, peacefully, in her sleep, my hand in her, the window opened and the rosemary bush blooming. And I was heartbroken, but not empty, because love like that doesn't leave. It lingers in the spaces where laughter once lived. It echoes in the voices of those you've loved. It grows like a garden you planted years ago, now tended by others. The Friday after the funeral, I wasn't sure if I could face the fire, but when I opened the door, they were already there. Chairs set up, cider to Boari Mom. No words, just presence. And someone had carved a small wooden sign, placed it at the center of the circle. In memory of Margaret, the heart of the flame. I wept. They held me. Space for the grief. Let the fire carry what words couldn't. And that night, I realized something. Grief isn't the end of love. It's its continuation. It's love without a place to go, So it gathers around the fire, sits quietly, and waits for the heart to open again. And mine did, in a savoring very gently, because she taught me how to, if you're grieving, friend, when I see you, I know the ache, the hollow, and the way the world keeps turning like it doesn't know. But I also know this, the love you gave and received, it's still here, in memory, in stories, in community, in the fire that never truly goes out. First time, I'll share the final chapter of this journey. Not an ending, but a beginning. A reflection on what all of this, storm, fire, friendship, love, has taught me at 65. And how, even now, I'm still learning, still healing, still becoming. I hope you'll join me. So here we are, 65 years old, a little slower on the steps, a little grayer in the beard, and a heart that's both heavier and lighter than it's ever been. Funny how life does that, makes you carry so much, and yet somehow you feel more free than when you were young and untouchable. People ask me sometimes, Joe, why do you tell these stories? Doesn't it hurt to remember? And I always smile and say, no, friend, it would hurt more to forget. Because remembering isn't just for nostalgia, it's for nourishment, for honoring the path behind so that the steps ahead make sense. The storm, the one that brought it all together, it didn't just knock down trees and power lines. It broke down walls that we'd spent years building between ourselves and the world. It took away the noise and left us with something simpler, something sacred, human connection. When I think back on it now, what I remember most isn't the darkness or the cold or the sound of the wind like it was tearing through the very soul of the town. What I remember is the knock on the door, the thermos of coffee, the soup passed around under candlelight, Jolene's laughter, Marshara Yishup's harmonica, the warmth that came not from electricity, but from each other. We had spent years nodding politely, living parallel lives, but in 1 week of forced stillness, we became something more than neighbors. We became kin. And that fire, our Friday night fire, it became more than tradition. It became a heartbeat, a lighthouse drum, a symbol that no matter how loud or fast the world outside became, there was still a place to slow down and be known. After Margaret passed, I wondered if the fire would fade, if people would drift back to their routines, to their isolation, but they didn't. And in fact, the issue is, it grew. More people came, or a new face, young and old, some curious, some cautious, but all hungry for something real. I started calling it the circle, and it wasn't just about marshmallows or music or even memories. And it was about belonging, and about building something in the quiet moments, and about remembering what storms teach us, that we need each other, that love is strongest when shared, that grief is gentler when witnessed, that healing comes not through time alone, but through time together. These days, I sit by that fire and watch others carry the torch. Martin leads the songs now. Denise brings fresh flowers from her garden. Nora, bless her, hosts craft nights for the kids before the fire starts. Even Caleb, my brother, shows up now and then with his grandkids in tow. I don't speak as much these days, not because I've run out of things to say, but because I've learned the wisdom of listening. But every now and then, someone new will sit beside me and ask, how did this all begin? And I'll lean in, smile soft, and say, it started with a storm, but it kept going because we chose not to forget. And that's what I want to leave with you. Friend, not just a story, but a reminder that wherever you are, however old or young, however loud or quiet your days may feel, you can choose to build your own fire. You can knock on a door. You can start a garden. You can show up with soup or a song or a story. And you can help turn strangers into neighbors and neighbors into family. This world needs that now more than ever. So thank you for walking with me through this journey and for sitting beside me in memory, for reminding me that once again, that stories don't just live in the past, Well, they live in the telling. And as long as we keep telling them, the fire never goes out. Take care of each other. Keep the circle warm. And if you ever find yourself caught in a storm, remember this. Sometimes the strongest shelter is each other. Good night, friend. And until next time, stay warm